everyone, and welcome to Still We Rise, a podcast from the Educational Institute of Scotland, Scotland's largest teaching trade union. My name is Selma Augestad. I'm National Officer for Equality Issues at the EIS. In this series, we explore how educators and trade unionists can join together and rise up against the influence of the far right in our schools, in our colleges, and in our wider society. Today, I'm chatting with Jordan and Liam from Time for Inclusive Education, a campaign group come charity who are now taking forward the rollout of the national approach to LGBT inclusive education in Scotland, and also a very large programme to tackle prejudicial disinformation amongst learners in Scottish schools. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having us.
So this isn't the first time that we're chatting about these issues. We've been working together for a number of years, but I'm really pleased that you're here today for IDAHOBIT to mark that day, and I suppose also to have a conversation about how the national approach to LGBT inclusive education came about in Scotland, where we are now a few years after the rollout began, and where we're going. So the first kind of question I suppose just to shape our conversation is, from your perspective, how did this national commitment to LGBT inclusive education, which was announced in 2018 and then the rollout began in 2021, how did that come about?
Yeah, so we began our work in 2015. I was 19 and Liam was 36?
30-something.
30-something at the time. We worked really hard to build up, firstly, the political and civic society support for LGBT inclusive education, and really trying to shift that narrative almost on seeing this as something that was maybe complex or difficult or controversial, much more into something that was essential. We were speaking recently, Liam, about how our early days of campaigning in 2015-16, people would sometimes ask about, Section 28 or 2A and say, but that's still in place, we're not allowed to do this. And I haven't heard that for a long time now. So I think often the big thing is that kind of dial shift on narrative.
So did you go to school during Section 2A in Scotland?
No, but I went to school coincidentally the year that it was repealed in Scotland. So my generation in the year 2000 of primary one pupils, my generation was supposed to be the first post-Section 28 generation.
And that's the thing, right? It doesn't happen overnight, just because there's a policy change. So for those listeners who maybe don't know, Section 2A in Scotland or Section 28 in England and Wales was a piece of government legislation that effectively prohibited using public funds to teach about the acceptability of homosexuality as a pretended family relationship, whatever that means. And I think that there was a lot of disinformation and a lack of clarity around what that actually meant at the time. And even when it was repealed through relentless campaigning by so many groups, including the EIS and LGBT activists across the country, even when it was repealed, I think the lingering kind of lack of clarity and kind of confusion around what is publicly okay to speak about, what types of relationships are publicly okay relationships that you can talk about in school and what are not. I think it's had a really, really significant silencing effect. So I'm not surprised that you didn't have an experience in school where that was talked about, because that type of change, in essence, it's linked to attitudes. And obviously we're recording this for IDAHOBIT, which is International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia and Transphobia. And I think it's so relevant even today in Scotland, where we have that national commitment to LGBT inclusive education, that that is a policy promise. Yeah. It doesn't happen overnight, and it is it really requires a significant commitment to embedding and the rollout, which you're taking a lead on through the Scottish Government, but also it requires that kind of slow work of changing attitudes, changing behaviours, and that takes much, much more time?
I think one of the things that kind of springs out to me from what you just said there, Selma, is the fact that you spoke about people learning about bullying not being okay. And one of the first conversations I had with Jordan when we decided we were going to go and do something to change or try and stop his experience being the norm for young people in schools is when he spoke to me about the fact that they learned about bullying and how bullying was not okay, and it was not okay due to religious domination, it wasn't okay due to race, but at never at any point was he told at school, or did they ever get the message at school, it's also not okay to bully someone because you think they may be gay. And that, for me, is possibly a hangover from Section 28, because people definitely were not just as sure. Some teachers were not sure about where they could go with that kind of thing. And of course, that then was devastating for generation after generation of young people.
And I think that's why it took a specific campaign focused on LGBT inclusive education to kind of redress that imbalance and highlight what is okay to say. It's the amount of stories that we've got from that early 2015-16 period of even concern around mentioning the word gay in a school context, or despite the fact that we've known for a long time that homophobic language is really normalised in schools, children often hear it very early on in primary schools, and it has, as Liam says, just been that nervousness, I think, historically, to approach this topic and this conversation that has just allowed that culture of homophobic bullying to continue.
Yeah, because, I mean, homophobia wasn't invented by the policy inclusion of Section 2A in Scotland, and it didn't go away with the removal of that clause. But certainly it's a very positive development that we no longer have Section 2A in Scotland, and that we have this national commitment. I suppose I'm curious from your perspective, going into schools and delivering this, where do you feel like we are at now?
We're in a better place than we were in 2015, that's for sure. However, I don't think you can underestimate the enormity of us as a tiny organisation with 7 members of staff trying to roll out a national policy to 2,500 schools. So it's incredibly challenging. But what we do know from the schools that we are working with regularly and the schools that have implemented their LGBT inclusive curriculums is that it's having huge benefits for young people. We hear stories of young people who happen to have 2 mummies or 2 daddies who have become more confident at the primary setting to talk about their family dynamic when they return to school on Monday. And that's as simple as children not feeling confident to tell classmates or teachers that they were at the cinema with their mums or their dads. And you wonder, what does that do to a young person when they don't feel that they can talk about their parents and their domestic circumstances when they're in their school?
It's phenomenal, because when we, again, started our work, much of what you would see from young people talking about LGBT topics at school was consistently negative. It was always, things that I experienced across generations, reported time and time again. And so to actually be in the position where we are able to see the impact that it has in real real circumstances, and hear from children and young people saying things like, before my school did this work, I felt as though I had to hide the fact that I was gay, but now I feel like I don't have to hide that anymore. Or young people saying, I am part of the LGBT community and I've never learned about anyone like me, and it's been amazing to learn about people like me. So actually just that, it's the voices of the school pupils that often, I think, really make the difference, and probably help us as well reflect on how far things have come, because 2015 was a very different place, and we had to do, sometimes quite a lot of work to try and convince people that having an educational approach to addressing homophobic, biphobic and transphobic bullying was necessary.
Yeah, and I think another thing that is very visible in your work, and a key kind of part to the success of your work, is that you work so well in partnership with the people who are delivering in this kind of content day in, day out. So you work really closely with teachers, and EIS has been an affiliate of TIES for a very, very long time. Very proud to work in collaboration with you guys. on taking this forward and making sure that it's embedded, that people feel confident. But I think that's a real strength to your work. Obviously, neither of you have a teaching background. I think it's crucial, actually, the way that you've gone about that in working with the profession to make sure that what you're delivering is meaningful and it's collaborative and it's in kind of solidarity with what is a really, really tough job sometimes. Yeah. I think also from what we're seeing from our members, from our perspective, is that at the moment, the schools that have implemented or began their journey for the implementation of LGBT inclusive education, which is across the curriculum for all ages in all public schools, those are quite happy with how that's going and their engagement with TIE. But there are also many schools in Scotland that are struggling to get buy-in for that, or maybe not even entertaining it because of workload issues, which are really, really significant and legitimate, but also like a lack of resourcing. But I think there's another thing here which is kind of linked back to the Section 2A era, which is that fear around, are we doing the right thing? Will there be complaints? Okay, there's a national policy, but are we going to be getting complaints from people? How do we create that kind of buy-in and that like confidence in the teaching population, in schools, in local authorities, that this is something that is the right thing to do? There's support available. There's a piece there, I think, that's really crucial, especially at the moment where there's such a rise in disinformed narratives across the board for all kind of equality areas, where, LGBT people, migrants, women, disabled people are becoming scapegoated by the far right and blamed for all sorts of issues, or just vilified. I think it's a really challenging context, and I know that you've experienced some of that.
We always listen to the profession, we always listen to teachers, and we always listen to the teaching unions, and we make sure that we build those strong relationships, because if we didn't get it right for teachers, they couldn't get it right for young people. And we were also really conscious about the workload issues with teachers. That's why we ended up with a fully kind of fleshed out wraparound approach from professional learning all the way through workshops and services delivered in school by our teachers to exemplar resources that teachers can take and use, or they can take and take inspiration from, or they can take and adapt. As for the Digital Discourse Initiative stuff, that is something that just literally hit us right in the face. It became abundantly clear that for us to get our LGBT inclusive education done right and done well in partnership with schools and teachers and trade unions, we had to challenge and take on this other issue that was getting in the way. It was almost as if we had a clear path or a clear sight towards an end goal, and all of a sudden this other thing came in and started to almost not block the way, but it started to kind of cloudy the waters and make life difficult for us and for teachers and schools.
Between 2015 and 2020, pre-COVID era, certainly, we were working with thousands and thousands and thousands of young people, and you could almost predict the patterns. You knew that if you were going into any primary school, it was going to be normalised use of homophobic language, use of the word gay as an insult. If you go to the secondary school setting, it will be homophobia, and are kind of connected with misogyny, gender stereotypes. And there were always really just quite robust patterns of responses that we used as organisations and that we helped teachers use as well. Then 2023 came along and it just became very clear that the whole manifestation of prejudice in school settings had changed because it was so influenced by online content. And this is, all around the same time that we're seeing a rise in the so-called manosphere, radical misogyny online. If you look at some of that content, I don't advise people do, but when you do, and we've had to for the work that we're doing, but you see just how that content pulls on racism and white supremacy, it pulls on transphobia, it pulls on homophobic content, and it mixes it all up into this big package that then young people are talking about in the school setting.
Because I remember when we started having a conversation about this, and when you were sharing your plans to develop something for learner workshops, and it just coming at a really, really good time. So I suppose for a few years prior to that, the EIS had been working on developing kind of models and strategies for responding to disinformation in relation to very specific equality areas. So it kind of came at this time of a lot of rise in disinformation in relation to trans people in particular. And I suppose a real kind of breakthrough in that work, which I had some experience of from a previous job before, to kind of navigate the communications around that and kind of people's escalated feelings and moral panics around that, was when I was in Australia and went to this really, really amazing workshop as part of a conference there that was around how to share messages that resonate with people's values. And that is the effective way that you kind of cut through the noise with a lot of disinformation that scapegoats minoritized groups. And I think the kind of the evidence base that that sat underneath that, so that's kind of a framework from ASO Communications that's very widely used for political reasons, but also in other kind of organizing groups for equality issues. It's just such a straightforward way, really, when you think about it, but having that evidence base is essential. So I just remember back in one of our first conversations when we had developed this kind of framework for how to respond and how to talk about trans rights in education. And we're thinking more about how could we take that approach and apply it to other equality areas, and then more and more thinking about the misogyny space as well, and seeing that kind of rise in violent and aggressive behaviours from our 2023 member survey that was disproportionately affecting women teachers. You know, all of these pieces at some point in 2023 kind of came together. So I think we were definitely at a very similar point in time, having this wealth of experience in relation to equality work, and then thinking something is happening here that is slightly accelerating or changing the tide. And of course, disinformation, prejudice is nothing new. Scapegoating minoritized groups is nothing new. It's a tactic as old as time that groups, especially far-right groups, use to kind of justify minimizing people's rights, taking away resources. Goes back to the witch trials, you know, to demonize and vilify people who are different so that you can take their land or resources. But it's very effective because it evokes really, really strong emotions in people.
Because countering the narratives that come from these online places is absolutely central to any strategy that's going to help, not guide young people, but help support young people to understand that some of the stuff they're being fed online is, one, false, and two, it's designed to make young people behave differently. Because
of online disinformation, one school that we had worked in, where a request had been received from a parent to remove their child from all teaching where LGBT might come up. That was erroneously authorised, which I think kind of goes to like a broader piece that you were talking about earlier around implementation structure, ensuring that local authorities and senior leaders are aware of what policy and guidance is. But it's not possible to remove a young person from a curriculum anytime LGBT comes up, same as it's, you know, not possible to do it for any other characteristic or topic. There is no right to general curriculum withdrawal in Scotland. There is a right to withdraw children and young people from planned sexual health education lessons as part of RSHP, but a young person can't be removed from learning just because the book that they're reading might talk about homophobic bullying, or if they're in history they might learn about Alan Turing. That's not appropriate, and you know, not just simply not possible. So I think there's kind of the broader consequences to this ecosystem of disinformation that do often have negative effects in schools and education settings.
When you show parents and carers what LGBT inclusive education actually is, and not allow it to ferment as some abstract concept, parents and carers are like, well, of course this is what young people should be learning, because it's a modern world. And in fact, when I've had conversations with parents in my own life away from work, parents and carers are often quite surprised as well when they learn that the majority of young people who are bullied for being gay are not. They're not young people who are gay, they're young people who are being, stereotyped and treated differently, simply because of those stereotypes and the gender expectations. But we done a survey with parents and carers previously, and what we done when we surveyed them through a polling company was we showed them examples of what the National Resources for LGBT Inclusive Education looks like. And we weren't surprised when it came back at the end of the survey period, when we had surveyed parents from every part of the country, and 84% of parents and carers either supported the LGBT inclusive learning that we showed them or were kind of ambivalent to it. So I don't think policies that are implemented by governments often get that sort of approval. So we'll take that all day long.
Yeah, when it's demystified,
Yes.
it really, really helps. And I think that's been a real shift coming from a very kind of hardcore feminist background to thinking about what words, what messages, what values are actually going to resonate with people at a time where they're becoming increasingly scared by what they're reading online or angry about what they're reading online. And I think that is just poses a whole other set of like issues and but also quite an interesting opportunity in our way of thinking about how can we find out about what people need to stick to their values no matter what kind of things are thrown at them in terms of false information online. How can we build up that resilience for people? So that is part of why we're entering into this collaboration to take forward some anti-prejudicial disinformation work locally, because at the moment there are so many areas in Scotland who are really struggling with this, and no wonder why. With the best will in the world, I think it is really, really tricky to navigate these conversations that are disinformed, because false information is kind of a real threat to democracy and to having productive, empathy-based social dialogues.
Just to pick up on something that you pointed out about how a lot of online content, especially a lot of narratives, disinformation content, is purposefully designed to target strong emotions, and the strongest emotions are anger and fear. And again, this is nothing new, but we see a lot of content talking about schools and education settings, because in those environments are children and young people, and everyone wants to keep children and young people safe. We have had the kind of privilege to work with teachers and educators across Scotland for just over a decade now, and as you mentioned, we've always worked with the EIS, and the teachers that I see in my day-to-day work are very qualified professionals who go above and beyond to support children and young people who deal with a myriad of the most complex, difficult, often heartbreaking things that children and young people can experience. And I've got utmost respect for teachers and school staff, and so there is often a bit for me where I see this type of disinformation content that targets schools or education settings or curriculum content, and kind of hypothesizes whether something's appropriate in schools or not. I always just read that as a complete undermining of the teaching profession, and I think that a lot more people need to just get a lot more confident and say that and back teachers up and support teachers, and not allow our education system to be undermined and not allow our teaching profession to be undermined in that way, because education is one of the core pillars of any democratic society.
And it's one of the key tools that we have to actually reverse this trend that we're seeing. So yeah, definitely. And there are loads of resources out there. We have guidance on anti-disinformation through the Let's Change the Story campaign. You have guidance as well through the Digital Discourse Initiative and the implementation of learning workshops on that.
Well, we should say that those Digital Discourse Initiative workshops will be available very soon. They form part of the collaboration that we're looking at, and they'll be available more widely for schools in Scotland, we're hoping, in the new term, but we'd definitely encourage schools to engage with them. And in the meantime, the Digital Discourse Initiative professional learning course is, of course, available for teachers and school staff, and goes into much more detail on all of the topics that we've been discussing today.
Great. And yep, there's a few opportunities coming up as well for EIS members. We have a workshop for equality networks on the 29th of May, which is really exciting, about how to have effective communication and conversations in this disinformation era and take equality forward. We are also doing a fringe event for our AGM where members can come along and think about how they can change their story through social dialogue. So I suppose our focus at the moment is more on adult-to-adult conversations and also how to build up activist kind of confidence in having tricky conversations in this space. So really, really complementary work, I think, which is exciting. And yeah, more on that to come. So thank you so much, Jordan and Liam, for coming in.
Thank you for having us, Selma.
And keep an eye out on our website, Disrupt Disinformation, Let's Change the Story, for more news and updates about events and opportunities. You can find our guidance on there as well, and find out more about our upcoming collaboration with TAI, which we're really excited to take out into local areas.